have Reimer here with us, whom I met the first time in Copenhagen a couple of years ago. We were on a panel together. Very interesting work in the spirit very much of our school, which is around communication and media and information, right? So I think we're in a kind of privileged position to hear some new and cutting scholarship from Sweden, but also to sort of understand how their project and their program is organized in a way very sympathetically or similarly to ours, and maybe where we have places to grow. We were just talking about media technology, for instance, on the train here. But so Professor Reimer is a professor of media and communication studies at the School of Art and Communication at Malmo University in Malmo, Sweden, which is very close to Copenhagen, if anyone wants to know, southern western Sweden. He's the founding director of, do you say MEDEA or
yeah.
MEDEA? Collaborative Media Initiative at Malmo, and he is the author of the most common of practices on mass media use in late modernity, also of the politics of postmodernity, and his latest book is, if he can hold it up right here, I just saw it, called Collaborative Media, Production, Consumption, and Design Interventions, co-written with Jonas Lowgren at MIT last year, in 2013. So he's currently a visiting researcher at the School of Media Studies at the New School in New York. And so I had the privilege of seeing him a couple times while he's here, and I'm glad that you can see here to see what he has to say. Thanks.
Great. Thank you for the presentation and the invitation for me to come here to Rutgers, where I've never been here before, so it's really nice to come.
Sojourn to New Jersey.
Sorry? Yes. Excellent. So what I will do now is to talk about initially about collaborative media and about collaborative media interventions. And the point of departure for the work I do is based on maybe, let's say, the last 15 years of work I've been doing at Malmo University at the School of Arts and Communication, which is K3, which stands for Konst, Kultur, Kommunikation, Arts, Culture, Communication in Sweden, but the 3 Ks. And a research center called MEDEA, Collaborative Media Initiative, which is the founding director of. And the book which Ingrid showed, which I can send around, will be kind of the start of the talk which came out on MITPress last year. And Jonas Lowgren, my collaborator in the book, is professor of interaction design, so it is a kind of meeting between media and interaction design that we try to do in the book. I can also show that this book, which I'm not part of, but this is written by my colleagues at MEDEA and the School of Arts and Communication. It's called Making Futures. It actually came out basically this month also at MITpress. And like I said, modular notes on innovation, design, and democracy. So it's another collection of arguments and projects based in Malmo. It's on MITpress, and they've actually made a deal, so one chapter will become available free on the net once a month from now on, which is a bit unusual for the MITpress to do that, but I think they give up some royalties to do that, but that was worth it. So I'm going to start by talking about what I mean by collaborative media, in the sense that we see that as a way to talk about today's media landscape. And in a way, of course, that's clear there is a new media landscape, the way we have new forms of interactions with consumers becoming producers, the whole idea of creating web pages and so on. And you could talk about that in terms of new media, social media, and many other versions of that. But we believe that collaborative media is a better concept to do that with, in the way that collaboration is the one feature which is clearly indicating what this particular kind of communication is all about, which is about focusing on the action-oriented component on media, not on the technology in itself, but on what it actually can do. And it's also obviously dealing with the idea that more and more things can be seen as media today, with the whole discussion around Internet of Things and so on. And in like some opinions that maybe 20 to 30 billion devices will be connected to the internet in 5 years' time. So the definition we use in the book is this one: collaborative media is a particular cultural form for collaborative mediated practice. Cultural form coming from the idea from Raymond Williams, the British cultural theorist. And this also, I would say, in line with the thinking around the whole time, things around digital humanities now, which is the kind of area we get close to as well, and the new relationship between not only media studies and interaction design, but also media studies and STS in many different ways. So, what are the properties? Well, like I said, there's a big ongoing discussion on this possibly new relationship between production and consumption. And that's kind of heated in many ways, a discussion of, is this really new? Isn't the case that people have always produced media by themselves? Is it good or bad? I mean, there's the discussion between the creativity on the one hand and the digital labor problem on the other hand. But we do argue that something has happened, and not least in distribution in that sense. I mean, people may produce for themselves, writing letters, diaries, and so on, but 1 billion Facebook users and 150 million bloggers and going up, that's something else in that sense. But the point we want to do is, in a way, saying that it's not just production that's been added to people's everyday practices. It's also another thing, because when you think of mass communication, you think normally in a traditional model of you have a small number of media companies producing something for a big, large audience. But even with the old mass communication, behind that lies a kind of a media infrastructure, which is a prerequisite for any kind of media production. Things like buildings, studios, equipment, materials, software, and so on. But when you think about traditional mass media, in most cases, this was not something that you thought about or could do anything about. The infrastructure was there, you couldn't really tinker with it in a way. But in relation to collaborative media, that's our point, that there are new possibilities of tinkering with this and to do something more about it. And that goes both for media professionals and for amateurs to do that. So the collaborative media infrastructure is much more flexible, much more modifiable. And it's also to a much greater extent possible to take part in the actual design of it. Maybe not the buildings, but the hardware and the software, due to open source processes, due to open APIs, and in general more user-friendly technology in different ways. Things like Linux or the Arduino hardware. Do you know Arduino? It's actually constructed by a colleague of mine in Malmo, who was one of the 3 creators of Arduino, but it's been working with us for the last 5 years. So generally, the people within a media and interested citizens can now then participate in creating the tools that will enable different kinds of media productions. So designing YouTube or designing Flickr is something quite different from producing a television show in the way that they are modifiable by users, and they're continuously being redesigned both by professionals and amateurs. So on the private level, it's possible to modify and personalize the infrastructure just to make it function better for yourself. You customize your iPad or your web page. But you can also take part in the general design process. First, companies create beta versions of both hardware and software for users to test. But also after launches, both hardware and software are continuously being redesigned, what you can call design after design. And here the original designers work together with media practitioners, but also with laypersons. But it's also possible to make adjustments and modifications that software designers had never thought about themselves. And when you think about mass communication, that kind of re-appropriation that required really specialized skills. And the classic example is probably how the hip-hop culture transformed record players into music instruments. That wasn't the idea from the beginning, but that was something people did. With collaborative media, that kind of re-appropriation is much more common, and that could lead to uses and modifications that are far away from what was initially intended. If you take something like the popularity or of the SMS that came from teenagers, didn't come from the industry. The hashtag function of Twitter came from users, did not come from industry, and so on. So those examples. And conceptually for us, this means that if you take one of the traditional ways of looking at mass communication models, this is a model from Stuart Hall, which is the old encoding, decoding model. You have some people encoding meanings into messages and other people decoding that based on 2 moments, and it's going one way to the other. The way we look at collaborative media is more like this, which is based on a relationship not between 2, but between 3 moments, where you add the design part as well. And 3 points to make about that. The first, that you have 3 moments, the moments of design, production, and consumption. They're separate, but they are linked together in the same network. Secondly, the same person can both design, produce, and consume. In the old model, the roles were clear cuts. Infrastructure was created by engineers, technicians, designers. Production was the work of media practitioners. Consumers were consumers. Of course, today the infrastructure is primarily still made by designers or technicians, but also laypersons and media practitioners take part. A similar production is primarily made by professionals, but it's still also laypersons taking part. And thirdly, most of these practices are continuously ongoing today. In the old model, for many forms of media, consumption was never finished. The book was read over and over as long as it was in print. But design and production were moments set in particular points in time, and when they were done, they were done. That's not the case now. Here, production is ongoing. You have director's cuts coming out, audiences making mashups and so on. And both software and hardware continuously being remade and retuned in different ways. So there's a new relationship between pros and amateurs, and it's ongoing all the time. And it's also important to point out that this kind of new relationship, that's not exclusive to the media field. Citizens increasingly gather their knowledge, their own knowledge, in questioning experts. So you can see it as a more general thing where people take part in different kinds of productions. This Bruno Latour quote, for instance, that the sharp distinction between scientific laboratories experimenting on theories and phenomena inside and the political outside, where non-experts were getting by with human values, opinions and passions, is simply evaporating under our eyes. And the main point, we're not all embarked in the same collective experiment. So people gain knowledge about things like medicine, or gain knowledge about different planets, and take part in finding things that other people, that professionals have not seen. So the question of the role of media research in this, first of all, if you talk about media research, and media research here, I would say more general. I mean, that's basically what you do in this school in all the three departments in a way. It's of course difficult to talk about that as a singularity, that's just one way of doing it. But you could say primarily the work's been doing within humanities and social sciences. It's been analytical and critical. You theorize, you interpret, and you produce conclusions and say that's the way it looks like. And maybe you would add some normative statements saying that it should not be like this, it should be something else, but and maybe something about how it should look. But normally you stop there. There is an interest in seeing how, there may be an interest in how things could be, but it's still normally being done from a distance. You look at things and say how you could do, but you don't go into it. It's also based on reacting on things already there, already happening, and that's valuable, but it could be discussed if that's the only position to take. And what we mean is that the situation now has opened up is a possibility, need for much more practice-based approach to media studies. That is not a part of the traditional way of working as a media researcher. So what we argue in the book is that in today's media landscape, it's easier to take a much more interventionist stance than ever before. It's also much more important than before to do that. And so what we argue for is what's needed is a much more, like I said, design-oriented approach, a lab approach, but primarily, hopefully, a public space approach where you leave the university and go outside, a transdisciplinary one, and also one which is much more based on experiments. And here you can collaborate between media researchers and other researchers, because of course media is not the only interest for media research. You have people from media technology, informatics, HCI, computer science, artistic research, and so on and so on. You can just go on. And by going back to Latour, it's also a question that actors outside of the university that are interesting and have competences, stakeholders with sometimes similar interests, sometimes other interests. But so what we propose is then an approach where the social science and humanities join forces with practice-based research to conduct real-life experiments in the wild together with non-academic actors. And that's the point where you start a process that wouldn't have happened otherwise. I mean, not just react to what's there, but actually make sure things happen. And that's what we call collaborative media interventions. So I'm going to give some examples of what I mean by that kind of work, which we've been doing in Malmo since 1998 at our university. So just briefly about university, the school. We have a focus on design, media, art and technology, working cross-disciplinary, and doing this both in research and education, and try to integrate theory and practice. So people, or the Bauhaus School, people like John Dewey and Donald Sherman are kind of the persons basing this. We based the school and when we started. And so this new school is also wonderful to come to a place where you start something new, not by putting together schools or departments that may not want to work together, but everybody counts because they do want to work across boundary lines in new ways. And we then have PhD educations in media communication studies, interaction design, and also computer science now. Besides, we have this center called MEDEA, Collaborative Media Initiative. I can send around this more popular science version of that. That's a research center primarily focused on collaborative media and the way of doing co-productions with people outside the university, with media companies, but also with municipalities, organizations, and citizens. And there's also, not in our school, but in the school next door, a new research center on Internet of Things and People, which got quite a lot of money from the Swedish Research Foundation a while ago. So we try to combine the work more and more between media and interaction design, where we are, and computer science that are there, basically. So some examples of the kinds of projects we've been doing. We had, if you do cross-disciplinary work and you want to do big projects in Europe, of course, finding EU money is the best way to do that, because then you can get bigger samples, and then you need partners with different competences. You need both university partners, you need non-universities, and you need different kinds of competences. This is a project that ran for 5 years called Millennium New Media, where we work together with places like Cambridge University, British Telecom, Telefonica, who's the main Spanish mobile providers, and so on. With the idea of working with, this is a couple of years back, with having the word of interactivity as the main thing, how to make media productions in different kinds of genres more interactive. The work we did in Malmo, we did primarily with the help of public service Swedish television, and we worked on how you could try to use the archives that are laying around in a place like public service television and make them available again in new ways. So it was a project called My News and Sports My Way, to try to see the idea that, and this made 7 years ago, that if you watch a television show, how can you, if you find an interesting story, how can you find out more about that? Well, if you can connect that to the archive in some seamless way, then you can use that. So I'm just going to show the trailer or the beginning of the to see how that worked.
My News and Sports is a service that brings news and sports to the television via broadband delivery. The ground purpose of the My News and Sports My Way project is to look into the news genre of today and to step beyond the formalistic and restricting narrativity of moving image news. The production challenges the traditional top-down presentation of news and gives the user the power to shape his or her news experience by interacting with the news material in real time. The engager is not only in control over when and what material to consume, but also how to consume at each particular situation. Through the use of the NM2 toolset, the latest stories are always connected to a vast archive of in-depth material. This enables a service where previously non-flexible linear news transforms into a non-linear flexible resource. This gives the news genre a new form, more suitable for conveying information about the complex issues in society. My News and Sports has been developed in collaboration with SVT, the national public service broadcaster in Sweden.
Idag gav Socialstyrelsen klartecken för 3 familjer att med hjälp av provrörsbefruktning och genteknik välja ut ett friskt syskon som ska fungera som donator till deras svårt sjuka barn. En stor lättnad för familjen Rickardsson i Trollhättan.
At any time during playback, either in a My News program, a latest edition, or in a single clip, the user can interact with the material, changing the shape of the news by using the More and Related functions. If More is pressed, another clip dealing with the current topic will be added seamlessly after the current one. This enables a real-time, in-depth view on the news events that the user finds interesting and would like to find out more about. The clip we're currently watching is about ethics, genetics, donors, and the National Board of Health and Welfare. Press More, and the newest and most similar news clip is added to the program.
säga välkommen till Bo Lindblom, medicinalråd på Socialstyrelsen som tog det här beslutet, och Britt-Marie Frost som är barncancerläkare i Uppsala. Först dig Bo Lindblom, fanns det någon tvekan när ni tog beslutet?
Nej, egentligen inte. Vi tyckte att det här...
This takes us to a debate that features a man from the National Board of Health and Welfare and a pediatrician discussing the issue from an ethics perspective. Press skip, and we return to where we left the latest edition.
För första gången på 27 år möttes idag USA och Iran för samtal på diplomatisk nivå. Det skedde i Bagdad och ämnet var det
Now we have a clip that is about diplomacy in the Middle East. The US and Iran met for the first time in 27 years. I try more, and skip, and...
Det formella skälet till dagens möte mellan USAs och Irans Bagdad-ambassadörer är det här. Den till synes oändliga våldsspiral som Irak har dragits ner i sedan den amerikanska invasionen.
So you get the idea. It's kind of the discussion of the media convergence between television and the internet, which is now, of course, becoming much more active. It's kind of a part of what we were trying to do here a while ago. It's interesting to work with public service television, with the media producers there, because there was kind of a big fight with them, because quite a few journalists hated the whole idea of doing something like this, because that went against their idea of being able to choose what material the audience should see, rather than letting the audience do that. It's an interesting discussion. This is called My News and Sports. We focus on me. But we did a version of that which we called Our News and Sports Our Way, trying to make it a much more collective and social kind of experience, and also dealing with other sources than just public service television. I'm just going to show a short trailer on that as well, which is more a demo.
I just found out that there's going to be an international skateboarding competition here in Malmo in a few weeks. Yeah, it's going to be great. And the funny thing is, I only found out about it by coincidence. Last Wednesday, I was watching TV with Adam. It was a hockey game, not that great, but we were basically too tired to do anything useful. Then Adam told me he found something cool and wanted to show me.
Hey, I just found some great bull riding clips. You want to see them?
So I followed Adam to the clips. They looked pretty promising, but I was interrupted by the phone. By the time I was done, it was late and time for bed, so the clips would have to wait. The next day, I had some time to spare. I looked up Adam on my friends list to find the bull riding clips again, but he had a ton of clips, and I couldn't find the ones I wanted. I spotted Katie in the overview, and I figured that could be helpful. Katie's on Adam's friends list, and the one thing she and Adam have in common is they both love speed skating. The playlist actually came up pretty neat. I just sat there watching it for a while. This song guy was awesome, and the system had a whole bunch of clips on him. There was even an interview that Katie had made with Hassan last year in Marseille, and then uploaded. Yeah, I had no idea she'd even been there at the contest. And then the next day, the Malmo bull riding competition was at the top of my start page. I even knew about it before Adam did. Yeah, so I'm definitely going to go. I'll see you there.
So basically the idea is to try to not just combine television and the internet, but also making the kinds of productions that people make themselves available within the same area, and try to find ways, also communicating with the help of the television monitor and the screens and so on. So that's kind of work we're doing together with people from television, from the small production companies in Malmo and so on, where you go not just from new ways of consuming, but also new ways of actually taking part in productions and so on. I'm going to show an example of which is more about medical information, and this started that's not for some reason. Start again. Okay, so this is on medical information. It started in 2002, and the idea was this is a collaboration between researchers from my school and medical staff on an intensive care unit in Malmo at Malmo University Hospital. And the point here is that if you come to an intensive care unit, you really want to make sure that the personnel working there know how these extremely difficult instruments work. And the question is, who is the best to describe how they work? Because normally if you have an instruction manual, it says something like, push this button. It doesn't say push this button and kick hard to the right, otherwise it won't start. That's this kind of local knowledge that only people working with the things know about. So this project we started in the idea of trying to find out how best to make information available, wound up with the idea that, well, the best way is, of course, to have the personnel themselves make short actions that they film themselves that they can use when using instruments for the first or second time and so on. And I'll show you here what that looks like, how they on handheld devices can watch small videos while working.
Ska vi förbereda någonting där innan vi kopplar?
Eller kanske ta tasten här. Kan du göra? Ja. Den ska vi byta ut sen. Ja, jag ska göra nej. Det är det där som den. Jag har berättat lite vad vi har. Den ska vi byta ut. Det kan vi göra. Därför skulle vi kunna köra fram och sätta på den här.
You get the idea, right? And this, my two colleagues, well, they're not colleagues of mine now, but at the time they were PhD students, so that actually became the two PhDs out of that. One of which got the prize for the best thesis of the year at Malmo University. But it also became an award-winning project outside of the research project. So it's a kind of system that's been used in quite a lot of at the hospitals in Sweden since then. And it's been working wonderfully well, except for one place where the head came up with the idea, well, great, but it would be even better if we let professionals do this. And then, of course, it didn't work at all. I mean, because the whole idea was that this is something you do locally with people involved and so on. Okay, another urban intervention. This is a collaboration between us, a technical company, hip-hop organization, and the Regional Traffic Authority of Malmo. And the idea came from the authorities of Malmo who wanted to find out how can you make bus rides more pleasurable and also more quiet and not getting away from risk, security risks and so on. So what this group came up with was the idea that when you enter a bus on the mobile phone through Bluetooth, you get locally produced rap music to your phone. It looks like this.
tror du om detta? Är det en grej att kunna göra framöver? Litar man på det? Alltså, jag vet inte. Enligt min mening som det redan lyckats. Men litar man på om det bara kommer upp? Nu berättar jag ju för vad det var, men om du bara skulle få det i telefonen och så.
Alltså rent sådär spontant liksom. Alltså det får ju gärna... Men nu går det ändå massa sådana här... alltså databeskrivning. Man var lite mer men man kunde få fram på skärmen. Det här är långt. Gratisklåd. Skicka upp det på bussen. Så jag hade nog sett många nappar på det. Och det var nyfiken.
And that's kind of collaboration. We have many different kinds of stakeholders and working together, which could be complicated. And this did not get off the ground at the time, a couple of years ago, but now there's a new interest from the Malmo authorities, and now they've gotten some extra new funding to try to work on that. And also trying to get some money to, which is here called RGRA, which is a hip-hop organization, which is called the Voices of the People of the Streets of Malmo, so to make them possible to get something out of it as well. The final public experiment here is this. It's also with the Malmo city, with the traffic council. They started to collaborate with a small design innovation studio, which is old students of ours, in the idea of trying to work with urban planning, with the idea of how to get a discussion going on how cities would look, or particular streets would look in the future. So the idea was that they created this future periscope, a parapolis, where when you look through it and you turn around, you can see the street ahead of you, but how it may look 10 years from now. So within it you have different visions of the same street. So the point is that initially architects, designers and cultural geographers were hired to create different visions, and then people could have a look and then discuss them. But we came in the second stage and tried to make it more user-oriented, in the sense that instead of having the experts doing this, we opened a studio in one part of Malmo where people could create their own visions of the future, and then they were put into the periscopes, and then they were discussed after that. That's also been a success story in the way that this periscope has been exported to a number of Scandinavian cities by now, in that sense. The final thing I'm going to say is just also, Malmo is a very international cosmopolitan city with 1/3 of the people living in Malmo, where 400,000 people have at least one of their parents born in another country. And the most common boy name for people is Mohammed right now. So it's not a typical Swedish city in the way you normally would think. So what we're doing is trying also to have something called Arabic Game Jam, which is done a 48-hour game concept development once a year, where we try to come up with ideas for computer games for the Arabic market, which is huge, of course. So here's a way trying to combine that our students work with people from immigrant communities, with game companies, to try to come up with new concepts for games, basically. It's the third year we've done that now. So just final points, like I started with the role of collaborative media research. 5 points. First, of course, be collaborative in the way of trying to combine work across disciplines. Be interventionist in the way of don't take this traditional academic distance position. Do things in the public. Fourthly, also be agonistic. By that I mean that there's a difference between antagonism and agonism. Antagonism is where you cannot get along with another person, you can't talk at all. Agonism means that you can discuss with people. You may not agree on anything, but you can agree on talking about things at least. So try to find and realize that the people you work with, stakeholders, have different interests, and that's fine. We don't have to agree on everything. We can still do things together. And be accountable. That's also part of it. I mean, to get away from the kind of neutrality of thinking that it's not up to us what's happened. I mean, take care. If you start something, make sure that you actually go through all the way. For our sake, we do a lot of work in different neighborhoods in Malmo, and you have to realize if you start doing work, you cannot just go there for 2 weeks or one. If you start something, be prepared to stay for the next 5 years, something like that, and try to, which is difficult with student projects, but I mean, it's up to us to make sure that things hang together. So finally, some conclusions. The first, in a way, what I'm trying to talk about is that media infrastructures have become visible and in play in a new way that wasn't the case before. Secondly, that the possibilities to take part in this design and redesign of infrastructures are actually leading to a form of transformation of the field of media. And within my discipline, or the discipline of media studies, has been kind of such a focus on production consumption, so this transformation we're dealing with infrastructure has not really been visible within the field. And that shows in a way how media studies have always had a problem dealing seriously with materiality and technology. And in terms of Internet of Things and big data, that's not such a good thing. Okay, thank you.
From the Department of Library and Information Science. I'm an assistant professor here. I study health informatics, so I'm mostly interested in that, the ICU examples. But my question actually is, I really like to know there are so many interesting big projects, right? And how the motivation coming from? You know, in the design community, sometimes we talked about we need to go to the real world to find the problems, and then we start from there. And some other, designers like to say, okay, the real world users don't know what they want, and they cannot think that far. And basically, it's the designer's job to really create something that is no people experience that. And I just like to know also this very exciting project, for instance, how you actually started and what's the motivation. Especially, I was thinking that the bus, that actually in China I experienced, and the people, a lot of people really like it.
Yeah. Malmo is a fairly small city, and when Malmo University started in 1998, it was a fairly political decision to start a new university in it's the third biggest city, but there's a small town called Lund just around the corner, basically, which has a university, been there for 350 years. But Malmo is a working class city, so young people in Malmo did not go to Lund. So I mean, there was a reason to get people actually going to higher education. And I think there's a very easy connection between the university, between companies, between the city. People work together in many ways. So there's also quite a lot of media companies, small companies around where the university is based. So people mix. So there's a kind of ongoing meeting all the time, I think, which I did not feel the same way I came from before, from the University of Göteborg, which is in a bit biggest city and so on. So where things started here, I mean, they could actually start from many different directions. I mean, because they come up quite often in discussions and conversations that people have. So these could be student projects, they could be research-led, they could come from a company, but we try to find these spaces where people meet, like at MEDEA, for instance. So, and also there's something called the Media Evolution City, which is a big place for startups and companies where also academics go quite a lot. So it's kind of it's evolving in different ways for different projects.
Well, so I have a question, but just the first part would be just to make sure that you agree. Would you agree with the idea that that knowledge is sort of constructed or built through these interventions? And then, if so, what is the knowledge that's being built? Like, what's the joint learning from all these interventions and activities? Is there a broader picture emerging or something?
Can you tell us who you are as well?
Oh, sorry.
I think there are many different forms of learning, different kinds of knowledge coming out of each project. I mean, so I don't think there's one particular thing. But I think what is in common, I think, which is the starting point from us as researchers, is that we see ourselves as part of a big democracy project. I mean, to a great extent, we came to this school to try to change things. That could be anything from changing how the city of Malmo works and to find new ways of knowledge. So that's where we start in some ways. And then in each particular project, that could lead to new knowledge on how media function. It could lead to a new product which will be developed by a company could lead to maybe that the kids, from the hip hop organization realize that they should go to Malmo University or something like that. But I think the perspective on coming there to make a difference, I mean that's kind of a, which is very different from our colleagues at Lund University, who has a much more traditional academic way of looking from outside and seeing things. So
John Fowler from Journalism and Media Studies. And I wonder if you've got any data yet on how the users are responding to some of these interventions, whether it's people producing, consuming, or both.
We follow up, I mean, there are reports written on each project. So, I mean, they're piece by piece, though, data, but we don't have any survey data or large-scale data on the happenings as a whole in Malmo, anything like that. But it is more case study based in that sense, I would say.
So people are responding positively, or they're changing their behaviors and adapting to these new interventions, or any lessons you could point to yet, preliminary or not?
I think in the Making Futures book, the new one, there are some examples also of the, I mean, what I presented here are, in a way, the success stories, right? I mean, things that have gone well, and even if the hip-hop Bluetooth bus it's not on the buses yet, I mean, that is still going on, as something positive coming out. There are other examples of work that we do that have been much less successful, which there's a very interesting chapter in the book on trying to set up new incubators in Malmo, where it's quite clear that we came into a power struggle with local politicians, and that, in a way, they used the term the powerful strangers, something like that, the idea that people who did not take part in all these workshops, but they in the end just come in and close it down. I mean, so there are those power struggles at some kinds where things do not work at all. And I mean, also, we work a lot with the kinds of fairly tough neighborhoods, and the problem there is that many of these neighborhoods also tired or fed up with academics and journalists coming in, doing things and then going away. So we have to try to find a way to create that trust in what we do, and when that succeeds, then it works well. So I mean, that's taken a long time to reach that stage in many ways, I think. But I think like the hip hop Bluetooth buffs, obviously the medical information example is something that definitely has worked positively afterwards.
So maybe picking a little bit up on Mark's question, thinking about learning and knowledge sharing. In the course of your projects over the last decade or so, have you noticed any particularly positive forum? Are these hackathons? Are they collaborative, kind of distributed online collaborations going on? I mean, what is the kind of organizational efficacy there? How, what have you learned from it?
I think the space at MEDEA has been one of these spaces, as well as the space at Media Evolution City. Then we have had living labs as well as a kind of a concept in places, but it's taken time, because even if we want to make those spaces places where people with different competences meet, it's still difficult, because it becomes more, if it is on hackathon one night, then you have the people interested in that, and then you do something on sewing the next night, and other people. So getting this place where people turn up to the more unexpected things, that is very difficult to get going. It takes time.
I'm Ian Walkholder from the Library and Information Studies. Can you talk a little more about the role of the researcher interventionist, and to what extent, I mean, obviously it's going to vary across projects, but are there guidelines or limitations for that person's role? Do they end up can they end up being the person who's responsible for getting most of the work done, and therefore that's why it works? How do you work through that process?
There are no guidelines in that sense. That I think that is still, in a way, an ongoing conversation with people involved. I mean, and then you learn from that. There's nothing going on, which probably is the right time maybe to try to do that. I mean, to have that, but we don't. The role of I mean, I think the designer, for instance, here take a role which is much more of a facilitator than the one person normally doing things, which would be the more traditional design world. So facilitation is often a kind of word to use in this sense. The research is involved of different kinds. I mean, there's a difference between if I go in from a media background as compared to persons having the computing competence and so on. So there are different roles, but so I'm not sure if there's that's not a very good answer.
Trying to understand how the
Yeah.
process works.
Is there, so this kind of fits in with what I was asking before, is there sort of a question about knowledge? It doesn't have to be sort of the conventional when we talk about knowledge. It could be that, so this struggle in trying to figure out the role, there's some learning there about how to carry out the role.
Yeah.
Right? There might be a sense of change and, wait a minute, we used to think participation should be like this, but after trying this, that, and the other thing, we realize this is not the way to go. Participation needs to mean something else, and that entails a whole lot of other practice. And that's sort of, I was wondering, what is there a way of tracking or accumulating those insights as a kind of knowledge production, collective knowledge production from your group?
Yeah, and that's, I would say that that's something we, at the moment, still is in the sense of ongoing discussion around without having been able to focus that. I don't think that's in the Making Futures book either in that sense. No.
Because how to do that is
Yeah.
a really big question.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's kind of like feasibility questions that John was getting at, but it's also some other stuff.
Yeah.
I follow Nina's question actually. I also myself really like to know how much a researcher in the university can do. And I think the research culture here in the US, I often, at least in our field, we see like you can be a consultant or like you are really research oriented. And then so you cannot, within the university, you have a big project, right? And you have to have an entity like in the corporation or in the other hospital, for instance, right, to do the research. Pretty much in China, if your research is really theoretical based, if you do not implement something, it's really hard to get money, basically. You really have to implement, come up with a new products, come up with a new platform or something, right? So I'm just thinking about, is that the same thing like in your kind of research agenda? Like in Sweden universities, like you are very pragmatic oriented, is you really have to do something.
It's, if you want to have, there are different research fundings. You have these really traditional humanistic science where you apply for research grant for 3 years and you do the work yourself in a way and write and so on. But if you want to have these collaborations with more money, more involved, either it's EU funding or it's funding where you have to collaborate with, let's say, companies. Not in the sense that the companies would pay you as a researcher, but if you would go in to apply for a grant, let's say we want $1 million, then we will say that, and we have this and this and this company, and they will go into the project together with us, and they will put in work worth as much money as we put in. So so by having them collaborate with us, we can get funding from the state, basically. And then, but those projects are then very practical. Then there has to be a very clear outcome of what that would be in that sense. That's also obviously, I think, necessary to get the companies involved to do that. But so that's our spectrum from these very traditional, leading to articles, to doing these things.
Go ahead.
Okay.
Chris Leader, I'm a postdoc in LIS. The My TV and My Sports and News was very interesting. That providing context for based on that archive is really interesting. I would imagine that can only happen with a public broadcaster, as opposed to a network. Due to intellectual property, and I just doubt that they would be willing to be that open with what they own. Do you think that's true?
In general, that's true, but I think, if you look at, there's many different ways of making money. If someone with a big archive could let that go and get some advertising into it at the same time, maybe then that would open for things like that. I mean, if you look at what's on YouTube, so maybe that's possible now, but I mean, yes, it is definitely different, but it's also very difficult actually for public service with copyright and stuff like that. So, you know, sports events, stuff like that, you can't really use and so on. So for instance, so sports were completely outside what we could do here. Even within public service, they don't even have the rights to their own things, you know.
So just to follow up, are you aware of any similar types of work with other?
I think now the future. I mean, now things are going this direction. I mean, even commercially. So this, which seemed fairly unique at that time, is now basically what, you know. Yeah, what's happening, I guess.
To follow up on that, I'm wondering if you've had any connection with the folks at Internet Archive who created that news search that goes back to 2009 and allows you to separate clips, get transcripts of clips, and unglue them in a way that I think that your platform could amplify.
Yeah.
And I don't know how they've reconciled copyright issues, but it seems that all the networks, in fact, globally, have contributed to that huge archive, that growing archive.
Right.
And as I saw that, I was thinking, what if there was truly a collaboration on those two projects?
This was older. I mean, this finished before that, so we haven't gone on with that. So, but that would have been an obvious partner to look for in that sense. Did you? Yeah.
So I had a different question. I'm just wondering about the theoretical context for the work. There's a long history of public intervention campaigns in journalism and media. My dissertation 35 years ago was on a heart health campaign to teach people, you know, strategies to improve their health using media and designing new kinds of strategies to do that. But some of that's been criticized as being sort of social marketing. And I just wonder to what extent you connect to that theoretical domain, or is this distinct from it? How do you manage some of those critical questions about whether what you're doing is social marketing, for better or for worse, or, you know, what framework you kind of align with or differentiate from?
So when you did that work, did you see that as part of action research, or how was it?
It was a combination of things.
Yeah. Because I mean,
it was collaborative. Different, you know, public health people, communication people, and media people.
I mean, there's the connection to action research. What I think is the main difference is here trying to not take the position that it's ambivalent. On one hand, I say we stop processing, but we still want to. We don't want to come out to say we are the ones knowing what to do. I mean, it's more a way of trying to get people involved early on in that sense, so that we together can do something. But there's definitely that the action research tradition that we fall back upon, and but I mean, like you say, the risk for being criticized for collaborating with commercial partners, stuff like that, that's an ongoing discussion, because always, I mean, of course, if you want to make sure you can't be criticized, it's better just to stay behind your desk, and, you know. But that, I think we take that risk. I think it's worth it, but you have to defend it quite often in different occasions.
I was interested when you were, you know, talking about your university and contrasting it with the old university that's not so far away, and it seems to me that you're making a suggestion that these research interventions is the way that, and tell me if I misunderstood, that not just students but scholars should be doing their work. And I wonder, and it's, I mean, really just curiosity, I could understand either way, but I am picking up some tones that this is a challenge to sort of the traditional academic structure, because it's hard to evaluate the impact and effect, or at least the movement here seems not to be, you know, to evaluate the impact and effect. And I wondered if you could just speak to that question.
in a way, rhetorically, maybe more say this is the way forward. But I'm not suggesting that every academic piece of work should be of this kind. I mean, because obviously, it's fine. Lund is good in doing what they do. So that's also, we do one thing and they do something else. But the impact, obviously the impact is there's an
judging the sort of traditional measures of evaluation and how effective was it, how good is it compared to other techniques, or sort of at a more ethnographic level. How are the individuals who are engaged in this process collaborating, communicating, under what kind of circumstances does it succeed or does it fall out? And I wondered if
I don't think there's a difference there. I mean, the kind of work we do is as possible to evaluate in the traditional ways as a more traditional academic project. So I mean, and it's more question of in some projects there are people doing that things more than the other projects. But I don't think that's the main difference in that sense.
It isn't, but it also opens a really interesting question because traditional academic research is sort of premised on production and volume, not necessarily relevance to communities or society. We say all kinds of things that it's supposed to, but it's very rigorous and disciplinary. You could make that claim, of course, not everything is. So another kind of potential contribution is really how to make those assessments change the evaluation structure itself.
Exactly.
To some degree, I mean, and not all of it has to change, but some of it to recognize this work for what it does. It also needs to be evaluated.
Because
it's relevant to what it does,
yeah.
not on a set of standards that have really been built up around a completely different
And I think that's a question that is not particular for our school, but the whole of Malmo University is really fighting with ways to come up with good indicators of these things to show that, well, it doesn't mean obviously we have to publish as much as before traditional, but we do this as well. But there has to be some kind of, if this is going to be visible, you have to come up with good indicators, and that's extremely difficult, of course, because there's a timeline here and so on. But there's something which I think quite a few people are working on to try to come up with something like that.
Good morning. My name is Gibbins, and I'm a master's student. I want to know how can you apply or relate this collaborative model in democratic process where digital media is really important for people mobilization. Like now, new slow movements are emerging. So how can you relate? Yesterday, I was thinking about the importance of digital media because in the event yesterday with in Ferguson, in many cities people was in streets protesting, and all those events were presented in social networks, and I was fascinated how important is right now these kind of things. So I would like to know how can you relate to those democratic processes.
I think in a way on a general basis what we try to do is to get at the potentials of what we then call collaborative media, social media. How can we use that in a constructive way rather than a destructive way? And obviously this is part of the power struggle against all other ways of using it. But I think in a way, so the kinds of tools we try to come up with, as well as a kind of way of working with people from different parts of the community, is how we deal with that. I mean, we cannot come up with one solution for anything, but I mean trying to do the small things here and there, and then sense that's what we try to do.
Sharon Storter, Information Technology and Informatics program. You mentioned it was hard to get trust within some of the communities and with some of the people that you work with. Are there different populations that you hope to eventually work with, and what kind of projects are you thinking about as you move in those directions?
I think we try to work quite a little with tough areas where people, I don't want to say need help because that's okay, but people that are definitely not feeling outside of society in that way, and those are kinds of groups we do try to work with as much as possible.
I was thinking of your Arabic game jam type of activity. Are there other groups, sort of like the Arabic community, that you're like, you know, if we could just tap into this community, you know, we could work together and maybe highlight maybe some of the skills that they have, or maybe the ways that they use technology in a different manner than what maybe.
I mean, this hip hop organization we work quite a lot with, but there's a problem with that group, and also to some extent the Arabic game jam is highly gendered. It's easier to get to the boys than to the girls, you know. Yeah. And that's. But we've also been working with an organization which is an organization by Muslim women. There are about 50 or 100 of them who are in a way, they hardly speak Swedish. They're very difficult in coming out in the working space. They're seen like a problem in a way. I mean, but although they are the social knit in their environment, but they've been working. We've been working with them in different ways of trying to work with cooking, you know, and arranging companies around that. So that's why we're going towards the women, but that's been very difficult because they have also opposition within the families around that. But so that's a very, very tough group to work with.
Is gender an issue that you pay attention to? Because like with the Hip Hop Fest example, it seemed like there were a number of females in that particular clip. And that would be a community too that I might not necessarily connect a large female population with.
Yeah, we try to. I mean, like this women's organization, we do work with to make sure that it doesn't just become, you know, young boys that are the problem makers and something that we should solve.
Go back a little bit to the question about Ferguson, and what you also said earlier about some of the interventions have been more successful, some have met with more resistance, and I wonder to what extent that might have to do with whether what you're designing is sort of like a sustaining innovation as opposed to a disruptive innovation. The more disruptive one might be met with more resistance, but maybe that's really what's needed, more than the sustaining one. And the example I would give with My News, very interesting, and I would suggest though that to people in journalism, that's sort of a sustaining innovation. It doesn't really challenge the journalistic model. It lets you just provide more depth or context, et cetera. Whereas with what's happening now in Ferguson is bringing to light a problem we have in the US, and I think probably many other places, that many communities see the reality very differently. And yet journalism is still stuck in this old model that there's a reality, and we try to discover it and tell it. And only one version of it. What might be interesting, even though journalists would probably resist this, if you proposed it, which would be, we're going to do two different versions of the same news. One is from a perspective of sort of the black community, or a black community, and the other is a version from the white community. I was listening on NPR on the way in today, and this guy obviously must have been aligned with sort of the white view, just saying Michael Brown has never been blamed, it's the media's fault, because they immediately let people say other versions of reality, which were obviously completely wrong, because the grand jury came in and no indictment, so clearly the evidence is what it was. And yet, there's different points of view, and so I wonder whether you might see any evidence in your research so far that when you're trying to propose a more disruptive innovation, that actually might have more value, but that's what people resist because they're kind of committed to their old values
I agree. I mean, that probably could be the things that would be the most workable. Actually, your example in this project, My News of Sports, we actually did work with that kind of portraying 4 different versions that people could choose between as in one part of the work. But like I said before about that project, you said that it wasn't controversial, but in a way, at that time, it's interesting how things have changed in the news business, because 10 years ago, the idea that even if it contextual, it was still not the journalist deciding which story to come up, that was very problematic for them then. Today, I mean, obviously they've realized that that's gone that day completely, where they could choose completely, or decide.
I'm Joyce Valenza at MLAS. I think think it's really fascinating about the notion that we can curate one news story
Yeah.
and have multiple perspectives next to each other. Think about the impact that could have for media studies and for K-12 education. It's a fabulous media literacy eye-opener, don't you think? If we had that platform, we have these platforms in which we now can put works of art next to each other so that we can compare them in ways we couldn't ever do before. But what we need is that platform where we can really flexibly compare these stories. And with transcripts, it would be fascinating to be able to do that in various languages.
Yeah.
Well, let's thank Professor Reimer again.
Okay, thank you.